This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there and welcome to Global Business Africa. We'll be giving you insight into Africa's business and financial markets. I'm Uche Okoronkwo coming to you from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Let's start with a look at the markets. Now, emerging market stocks rose for a fifth straight session today. MSCI's emerging market index was up 0.4%. Now, traders say a rise of between 1.6% and 2.6% amongst Hong Kong's big tech stocks did help to support the index today. Now, South Africa's JSE All Share also hovering near record highs in line with its stronger global peers as we saw markets recover from an inflation-driven sell-off this week. Of course, it received some support from Thursday's medium-term budget policy statement as well. The Industrial 25 was up almost 4% on the day. Now, also coming up on today's show, we look at the climate pledges from the COP26 Climate Summit as it concludes. China's economy transforms from one dependent on farming to one that thrives on industry, trade, and technology. And the benefits of the black African olive plant that is growing in popularity in communities in rural Nigeria. Well, let's start off at the COP26 Climate Change Conference that is concluding in Glasgow, Scotland. A new version of the draft agreement was published earlier on Friday and includes unprecedented language around fossil fuels. Now, this is despite a fierce campaign from some major coal, oil and gas producers to have it removed entirely. The new draft included 2 words on fossil fuels that dilute an earlier draft, which had badly stated that the world should pledge to stop subsidies for fossil fuels in general and also phase them out going forward. Now, the latest proposal says countries should phase out unabated coal power, the dirtiest form of power, and inefficient subsidies for all fossil fuels, meaning coal, oil, and gas. Arab nations, many of which are big producers of oil and gas, had objected to the fossil fuel wording in the earlier draft. Now, other commitments include keeping alive the 2015 Paris Agreement's aspirational target to cap global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius and avoid its most disastrous impacts. The deal also asks countries to upgrade their 2030 emissions cutting plans by the end of 2022. This is a faster time frame than the UN's current 5-year review cycle. It also seeks to have climate pledges take into account different national circumstances. This refers to the differences between rich and poor nations. Now, also, government ministers will meet every year to check in on efforts to raise pre-2030 ambitions. The draft deal says that by 2025, rich countries should double their funding to help poor nations adapt to the climate impact. This a step forward from the previous draft, which did not set a date for a baseline. However, the proposal is foggy on the pledge for rich nations to give poorer nations $100 billion a year in climate finance by 2020. While this deadline was missed, it is now expected to be met in 2023. Now, the draft COP26 deal expresses deep regret at that missed $100 billion target, but does not spell out a plan to make sure the money arrives. Well, let's now get the latest from today's meeting. We're joined by Vincent McAvaney in London. Great to have you with us, Vincent. Now, of course, as those meetings come to an end today, depending on who you ask, this year's outcome was either too ambitious or a total flop. So what were some of the biggest surprises and, of course, disappointments from this year's COP26?
Well, of course, discussions are still ongoing in Glasgow. It looks like they're going to stretch into the weekend, so it's not possible yet to pass definitive judgment on the two-week meeting. On the disappointment side, though, firstly, there was a lot of frustration from many countries that Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping didn't actually attend the conference in person, given their high level of emissions. There was some annoyance about the organisation of the conference itself. We all saw those pictures of the long queues in the initial days due to issues with infrastructure and staffing. Also, Glasgow didn't have enough hotel capacity to accommodate the tens of thousands of attendees, and so there were people staying right across Scotland having to make long journeys back and forth. But on the plus side, there was that surprise announcement earlier in the week of a deal between the US and China, the world's two biggest economies and therefore also the two biggest polluters. That agreement creates a huge potential for areas of cooperation to try to hit the 1.5 degrees Celsius target, but the use and expansion of coal power is still a sticking point between the nations. Another big surprise was a number of car companies agreeing to phase out production of petrol and diesel combustion vehicles by 2040. Manufacturers including Ford, GM, Volvo, Mercedes and Jaguar Land Rover all signed up, as well as countries including the UK, India and Canada. However, disappointingly, Toyota, Volkswagen, BMW and Nissan declined to sign, as did Germany, Japan, the US and China. There was also little surprise but a lot of disappointment that Saudi Arabia proved to be the big hurdle to a substantial agreement. The oil-rich kingdom is being accused of frustrating action to move away from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources, seen as critical for reducing emissions to stop a rise of more than 1.5 degrees centigrade in average global temperatures.
Well, Vincent, also the big highlight of today was that new version of the COP26 draft agreement that was published. Critics say it doesn't quite reflect the urgency that was expressed by scientists. But what are the highlights? Is this agreement considered a game changer and a fair balance of demands from rich and poor nations?
Well, the reaction to the agreement has been rather mixed. There are some challenging demands. The draft asks for much tighter deadlines for governments to reveal their plans for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, for example, and it retains a key pledge for countries to upgrade their climate targets next year. But on the key issue of fossil fuels, the draft uses weaker language than a previous one in asking them to phase out subsidies for the fossil fuels. And even as the talks entered their last stretch, reports suggested that fierce bargaining was continuing on that issue. For its fans, the draft is a balancing act, trying to take in the demands of both climate vulnerable nations and large economies reliant on fossil fuels for its detractors. It's something of a missed opportunity, with disputes also still very much alive on how and how much richer nations should pay those poorer nations who are bearing the hit from climate change. But of course, a deal isn't yet done. Negotiations between the delegates from some 200 nations are still ongoing in Scotland. There is some suggestion that they could go on well into the weekend in order to not miss this opportunity.
Well, many thanks, Vincent, for that update. That, of course, is Vincent McAvaney. He is joining us there in London with an update on those events. Now, of course, Africa has been watching these negotiations quite closely. And let's discuss the implications of some of those decisions on the continent. We're joined by Enoch Chikava now. He's an interim director for agricultural development at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Great to have you with us on the show, sir. Now, of course, Africa relies heavily on its agricultural sector. And two especially worrying predictions are that areas currently providing about 70% of the total value of crop production in sub-Saharan Africa will come from areas where heat stress is at severe levels. Also, nearly all African nations are expected to reach that 2 degrees a warmer level between 2025 and 2040. So, sir, if we stay on that path, how then will this affect the average yields of crop staples such as cassava, maize, and wheat on the continent?
I mean, just to let you know that we are already living in a 1 degree warmer world. And just at 1 degree, we are already getting the frequency of droughts is increasing. We are getting more floods. And then I'm sure in Africa, you have been hearing of the fall armyworm locusts. So pests and diseases are actually increasing right now. And looking into the 1.5 degree warmer world, if we don't do much to reduce that, and then of course to your other point, to the 2 degree warmer world, at that prediction, yields will go down, I think, for rice, for maize, by almost close to 20%. And that's a big deal. And then there will be also a lot of impact to livestock, particularly on the heat. It will become very hot that people can't go out into the fields, to work. Again, this is what we are getting from the, from the projections. So it is going to be very devastating impact across the continent. If you then look at the most recent research, is that the impact of this crisis are not in the future. They are already a reality today. The most recent research says that in the past 60 years, the cut on the output production due to climate change globally is 21%. Again, these global numbers, they mask some of the regional realities. You take that same period, 60 years, in Africa, the production has been cut by 40%. So it doubles when you get to places like Africa, which are again closer to the equator. It is getting, water. It is also becoming a lot drier. Mind you, the impact are much worse for those who depend on rainfall for their production. And I'm sure you know that the irrigation infrastructure investment in Africa is less than 10%, which means close to 90% of the current production is all rain-fed. So that's why it is really, really urgent that we get more adaptation, climate-smart innovations being focused on sub-Saharan Africa.
Well, it is interesting that as important as the agriculture sector is to the continent, excuse me, the sector does account for the bulk of emissions in some economies on the continent. But as important as it is to reduce those emissions, what are adaptation efforts, are adaptation efforts considered more crucial for the continent? And just adding in that currently roughly 75% of climate financing goes to mitigation rather than adaptation. What are your insights on that?
Again, I mean, you've seen that, at COP26, we were trying so hard to explain why it is important to focus on adaptation without, of course, neglecting the mitigation, which is reducing the emissions for the long term. But adaptation is where we should be focusing because we need to reduce the impact which is already taking place right now. And you find that this narrative is not commonly shared across because of the realities of how important smallholder agriculture is globally. When you compare that in the US, and you are in Europe, you find that the people employed in agriculture more directly is only less than 2%. In Africa, it is more than 50%. And those economies in Europe and the US, they are not powered by agriculture anymore. It is the other sectors that are driving the economy. Again, you find that in the US, less than 5% of the GDP is from agriculture. You go to Europe, it's less than 1%. In Africa, it is more than 30%. So again, agriculture in Africa is not just about food security. It's not just about producing food. It is also linked to the economic growth, economic prosperity. And I think for the most people who grew up on a smallholder farm like myself, you know that you need to make agriculture work because it is a job. That is the only job which people have. You look at it now building back, from the COVID. All the efforts should be on smallholder agriculture because that's the bulk of where the people are, and it is the way out of extreme poverty and into propelling those economies, into wealth creation and then economic growth.
Well, on that note, Mr. Chikava, how then do you feel about that final COP26 draft agreement and those negotiations? It is said to be softer compared to the first. They did say, though, that calls for the world's richest nations to provide more money to African nations, to developing nations, did strengthen. But in case that doesn't bear fruit, what adaptation strategies could sub-Saharan economies look to in terms of funds given to their current resource, due to their current resource constraints? What are your thoughts?
At the COP26, I'm sure you've heard that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has committed $315 million to be funding the global research called the CG system. And again, here is a global research organization which is made up of really state-of-the-art 15 agricultural research stations, across the world, which again it is in 108 countries, including I think all the 49 countries are part of that. So we believe that the CG system is well positioned to be developing climate smart, tools for smallholder farmers, like drought tolerant crop varieties in maize, in rice, in cassava, in millet, in cowpea, all those crops that are important for food security, but also for profitability of the smallholder farmers. So on our part, we are joined also by other organizations. I'm sure you heard the USAID also joined there, announcing again with others a total of $575 million in the next 3 years. But that is not enough. Today, this global machine is funded to close to $1 billion per year. And the research, it points out that it needs to become a $2 billion per year system for them to adequately address all these adaptation needs for the smallholder farmers. So we are hoping many other donors and countries will be joining, on that specific, mission of making sure that again all these tools in crops, in livestock, in early warning systems, in digital extension, so that all the information now regarding all the newer varieties can reach to the farmers, fastest possible. I'm sure you all know that extension is a big challenge, today. Not so many countries have the foot soldiers on the ground. You go across the whole continent, you find that one extension officer in Nigeria, for example, is responsible for 10,000 farmers. You go to Uganda, one extension officer, 5,000 farmers. We need new tools, and I think digital will then open up. So there are a lot of those tools which are classified as a climate smart, tools and products, which will be helping the smallholder farmers.
Well, certainly sounds cautiously hopeful. Many thanks for your insights, Mr. Chikava. That, of course, was Enoch Chikava, Interim Director for Agricultural Development at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Let's move to South Africa now, where President Cyril Ramaphosa has announced that the country has secured an $8.5 billion international climate finance deal to help accelerate the country's transition away from coal to renewable energy sources. Here's CGTN's Angelo Coppola with the details.
The funding is a bid to transition from coal towards green energy. It's a partnership between South Africa, the US, the UK, France, Germany and the European Union.
The funds at this stage are allocated to 3 areas. The first is for the Eskom Just Energy Transition, which we expect to receive the lion's share of this first initial allocation of funds, and as well to support the introduction of electric vehicles into South Africa, as well as a transition to an increasingly hydrogen-based economy.
Following the announcement at the COP26 talks in Glasgow, authorities have moved quickly.
A technical task team has already been established under the leadership of the presidency. The presidency has nominated a senior official to coordinate and lead that technical task team, and negotiations will commence, I am told, very shortly.
Climate change activists are hopeful that the loan will achieve its goal, but there are concerns too.
It's a really positive agreement, but at the same time it is a political agreement. So what remains to be seen is how exactly they'll flesh out that agreement, what the details will look like, how fast we'll be transitioning, what they will fund, and what the conditions of that funding will be.
And then there are the concerns over the position taken by the country's mineral and energy minister on the future of coal-fired power stations.
Minister Gwede Mantashe, just a few days after the agreement, went on a big international platform and talked about how we have to be fighting against the anti-fossil fuel agenda. Given that he is the most powerful minister in charge of our energy, it's a worrying sign that he's pushing back against what is supposed to be progress for South Africa.
While the news has been welcomed, there are questions around Eskom and whether it can fulfill its requirements, considering its history and the overruns in budget and time allocation for Medupi and Kusile power stations. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Well, let's stay with the final day of the COP26 Climate Summit. Let's find out what climate advocates think about this year's deal. We're now joined by Chairman of the Foundation Earth Love United, Jean Missenhoen. Great to have you with us on the show. Now, of course, Earth Love United, your main aim is to educate and raise awareness on environmental challenges, but most importantly, you're fighting against climate injustice. So how do you feel then about this agreement presented and certainly the tone of the overall negotiations this year?
Again, thanks for having me on. Clearly, as you know, the negotiations are still ongoing. But the key, what I call the key theme that we can take from the two weeks of negotiation are very clear. It's clearly, you know, a need for climate action, and not only the world leaders understand that, but you know, the young generation is basically has been pressing on that, and that's all about what we do with, you know, the foundation. So we're definitely pleased by this whole, you know, dynamic about climate action.
Well, one of the key areas where we're still lacking globally and, of course, in Africa is in the technology needed to help cap and, of course, cut planet warming emissions. Your research has revealed some nature-based solutions to this. Can you give us some insight into that research?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, clearly, you know, as we know, Africa is not basically the one who create the most pollution, but unfortunately is the one with most suffering from, you know, the pollution coming from the major industrial countries. But the good news here is, you know, as we transition to a new world, Africa is definitely and clearly a key beneficiary of that transition if the right policies and education have been put in place. And our research have actually demonstrated that. We have been researching about, you know, nature-based carbon capture and storage, which totally against, you know, I would even say it's totally going against the overall, you know, position that people like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos have been taking, which are primarily around, you know, technology for technology's sake. So we have currently a major pilot site in Benin where we'll be deploying that technologies. Our objective is to go to 1 gigaton of carbon capture over the course of, you know, 3 or 4 years, which is a massive, you know, endeavor itself. So we believe that, you know, the solution will come from Africa, and we actually basically do that today.
Quite interesting. Well, we do have to leave it there, but many thanks for your insights there. That, of course, is Chairman of the Foundation Earth Love United, Jean Missenhoen, joining us there in Cotonou. Now, moving to Egypt, the country has officially been selected to host the COP27 UN Climate Change Conference in 2022. Now, the country's Environment Ministry says that the event will be held at the Red Sea resort of Sharm el-Sheikh. He further says that Egypt's priorities as host will be climate finance, adaptation, loss and damage.
That COP27 will be truly an African COP, where we hope that we can make a breakthrough on priority areas that continue to be a priority for the continent, but for the whole world and the parties, such as climate finance, adaptation, loss and damage, to go along with the progress on mitigation efforts and related aspiration to achieve carbon neutrality.
Of course, 1 year after that, in 2023, COP28 will be held in the United Arab Emirates. Well, let's now take a look at our corporate headlines today. AstraZeneca's COVID-19 vaccine has boosted the company's earnings in the third quarter after it posted $1.05 billion in vaccine sales for the period. Now, AstraZeneca also unveiled plans to set up a separate unit for vaccines and antibody treatments to focus on its coronavirus efforts. Total revenue jumped 47% to $9.7 billion for the 3 months to September on a constant currency basis, while core earnings came in at $1.08 per share. Meanwhile, Johnson & Johnson is set to split into two companies. The company will separate its consumer health division that sells Band-Aids and baby powder from its pharmaceuticals and medical devices business. Now, the move by the company comes after similar announcements this week by industrial conglomerate General Electric. Also breaking up is Japanese firm Toshiba Corporation that has outlined plans to split into 3 independent companies. The plan is partly aimed at encouraging activist shareholders to exit. Now, Toshiba hopes to complete the reorganization by the second half of 2023 financial year, with an aim to return around $875 million to shareholders over the next 2 financial years. And finally, Africa's largest pay TV operator, MultiChoice, is sticking to its guns over a multi-billion-dollar tax dispute with the Nigerian government. It says the tax authorities in the West African nation made a mistake by slapping it with a $4.4 billion tax bill. The claim is well above the company's market value of about $3.8 billion. The group is challenging the penalty imposed by the Federal Inland Revenue Service, which says that MultiChoice skipped taxes and denied auditors access to its service. And that is a look at our corporate headlines. Well, let's head into a short break now, still coming up on the show. Ghana's debt rises above 75% of GDP, causing concern amongst economists. And Kenyan trucks carrying fish held in Uganda as a row over the exports between the two countries remains unresolved.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Central Nigeria. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Welcome back. Well, let's head to Ghana now. The country's debt is rising, causing economists to be concerned over the country's ability to get more loans and support its economy next year. Now, the West African nation's debt owed to the international capital market is now more than $13 billion, which is above 75% of its gross domestic product. Some analysts want the government to seek a bailout from the International Monetary Fund. Here's CGTN's Nabil Ahmed Rufai with more.
Ghana's total debt is currently more than $54 billion, about 76% of its gross domestic product. The government says the increase in debt is due to a $3 billion loan acquired from the international capital market in April, which was used to offset old debts and also fund infrastructure development. Analysts say it could be difficult for Ghana to pay back as the interest on the loans go up.
When you are choked with debt, what do? Don't you stop borrowing? And how would you stop borrowing? It's a matter of what? Making sure that you cut your coat according to your size. Making sure that you limit unnecessary expenditure.
The government says it will borrow from the international capital market to support its economic growth, but some analysts want the government to seek a bailout from the IMF.
Now, if you go to IMF, the cost will be that, okay, fine, don't spend up to this level. Don't employ up to this level. If you can absorb this cost, right, relative to going to borrow on the Eurobond market and then carrying some interest rate, I mean, cost-efficient analysis, you go for the minimum one. So that's the analysis I'll put on the table. And if I realize that going to IMF will be cheaper for the economy, I'll go to IMF.
Still, there are concerns that Ghana may not be able to acquire loans from the international capital market next year due to its struggling economy. International research firm Red Intelligence says Ghana may consider seeking debt relief from the G20 countries. While credit ratings agencies Fitch and Moody's have downgraded the country's economy to negative, the World Bank has urged the government to rein in spending and consider increasing tax revenues to avoid defaulting on its debts. Nabil Ahmed Rufai, CGTN, Accra, Ghana.
Meanwhile, a row over fish exports is brewing between Kenya and Uganda. The dispute follows the seizure of 5 Kenyan trucks carrying fish which were destined for the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, the owners of the impounded fish are seeking intervention from leaders of both nations. Here's CGTN's Hilary Ayesiga with the latest.
These trucks loaded with fish have been parked here at the Ugandan border for close to 3 weeks. The Kenyan owners are not happy with the Ugandan authorities for impounding their goods worth thousands of dollars.
They broke the seals. We were not there. We don't know where they got an order of breaking our seals. The goods were on transit. We don't sell fish in Uganda. Our goods are on transit to DRC Congo.
They are now demanding the immediate release of their goods.
We went to a commissioner, a high commissioner. The report is there everywhere. And we were expecting the feedback to give us so that they release our trucks to DRC Congo.
But Ugandan authorities insist it's contraband.
The increased trade of immature fish to DRC Congo, with some of it first taken to Kenya, repacked and passed through Ugandan borders and put fish on transit.
Ugandan authorities claim the traders connive with customs officials to smuggle the immature fish through Uganda, and they are determined to fight the vice.
We are going to have abrupt inspectors at any time, beginning from today. We are going to make sure that we have people that we deploy at any time to check why the increasing illegal fishing is taking place.
Ugandan fisheries authorities have recently reported a decline in the country's fish exports attributed to illegal fishing practices. Figures from Bank of Uganda show that fish exports dropped from $10.6 million in January 2021 to $6.6 million in July 2021. Fish is one of Uganda's top foreign exchange earners. The government believes stamping out illegal trade in immature fish could help boost exports. But economic analysts argue the current standoff with Kenyan traders could strain relations between the two countries. Hilary Ayesiga, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
You're watching Global Business Africa. Let's take a short break now, but still to come on the show. China's economy transforms from one dependent on farming to one that thrives on industry, trade, and technology. And some of the trends that emerged from Thursday's single-day shopping. Change is on the horizon. Through the shifting of time, Africa's emerging tech landscape is creating new channels.
There's a hunger for local African content globally.
Shaped by innovation, carved out by a new generation of digital entrepreneurs, sculpted by a mobile revolution, and trickling down to the most remote corners of the continent. TechSpot is seeking out the new concepts in technology, disrupting Africa's traditional sectors.
You're watching breaking news on CGTN.
Welcome to the world today on CGTN.
And here's a quick recap of other headlines this hour. Ethiopia says it will punish United Nations or African Union staff who break the law. The Foreign Ministry said on Thursday everyone will be held accountable after the arrest of several aid workers. Now, the UN says at least 9 of its staff members and dozens of truck drivers have been detained without cause. They had been delivering aid to parts of Ethiopia which are affected by fighting between the government and forces from Tigray. And Sudan's Khartoum state has announced it will close off bridges across the River Nile ahead of Saturday's planned protests. That's according to Sudan TV. Now, pro-democracy supporters have called for mass demonstrations to decry last month's military takeover and the appointment of a new ruling council by the army chief who led that takeover. Now, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan on Thursday swore himself in as leader of that council. And Nigeria's government is coming under mounting pressure to declare members of criminal gangs terrorists. Advocates argue this will allow Nigeria's security services to expand their remit and bring the growing threat from bandits under control. Others claim labeling criminal gangs terrorists isn't fair or justified. And finally, the news of Frederick Willem, or F.W. de Klerk's death has been met with mixed reactions across South Africa. De Klerk died on Thursday at the age of 85 after battling cancer. South Africans differ on memories and views on the country's last apartheid president. And that's a recap of other headlines this hour. And now to some international news. We begin with the 6th plenary session of the 19th CPC Central Committee. In a briefing following the plenum, CPC officials have shared where the party goes from here and the conclusions on its 100 years of achievements and experience. Here's CGTN's Sunye reporting.
A historic plenum and a historic resolution explained.
The party has achieved many encouraging accomplishments and triumphed over many challenges. Now the party, the army, and the people have become stronger and more united than ever. Our experience has proved that it is the wishes of Chinese people of all ethnicities that position Xi Jinping at the core of the CPC. And Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era as a guiding thought. Xi Jinping and the Xi Jinping thought are of decisive significance to the cause of the CPC and the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation.
The plenum had affirmed to uphold General Secretary Xi Jinping's core position on the party Central Committee and in the party as a whole, and uphold the Central Committee's authority and its centralized, unified leadership. The resolution aims to lay out what made China's transformation possible and sustainable for the future. Among the most compelling declarations, core leadership is important.
For a country or political party, the core of leadership is crucial. Former CPC leader Deng Xiaoping once pointed out that a leadership without a core cannot be relied on. The party has more than 95 million members. China has 56 ethnic groups and a population of 1.4 billion. It is inconceivable that the CPC Central Committee and the entire party do not have a core. Only when the Central Committee and the whole party have a core can the party gain strength. Since the 18th National Congress, Xi Jinping has led the party forward to make multiple historic achievements and introduce a new era of socialism with Chinese characteristics. A Shaokang society is achieved nationwide. To establish Comrade Xi Jinping is the core of the Central Committee, and the entire party is the call of the times, the choice of history, and the aspiration of the people.
Head of the Institute of Party History and Literature of the CPC Central Committee, Qu Qingshan, also said the party's two previous resolutions on historical issues had unified the thoughts of party members at critical historical moments and created a guarantee of the success of the party. He said he expected this new resolution will do the same and perhaps will be of even greater significance with the 20th National Congress coming next year. Sun Ye, CGTN, Beijing.
Now, of course, in the last century, China's economy has transformed from one dependent on farming to one that thrives on industry, trade, and technology. Here's a look at some of those major changes.
Before the concept of GDP was introduced in 1934, customs revenue was a key parameter to measure a nation's economic strength. Back in 1921, China's customs revenue stood at no more than 100 million silver dollars. That number slowly climbed and quadrupled 10 years later. As Western nations industrialized in the 19th century, China remained largely an agrarian economy, putting it at a disadvantage globally. The Japanese invasion and an ensuing civil war devastated China's economy. 3 years after the founding of the People's Republic, the nation's GDP stood at only 68 billion yuan. It wasn't until 1978 that real changes began to take place, when China started economic reforms and opened up to the outside. In 1986, the GDP surpassed 1 trillion yuan. In year 2000, China overtook Italy as the 6th largest economy in the world, only slightly behind France. But the GDP was still only 1/10 of that of the United States, the world's largest. 1 year later, China joined the World Trade Organization and has since integrated itself further with the world. In 2010, it overtook Japan to become the world's 2nd largest economy. China's economy is not only large in size, but also resilient. Last year, despite the pandemic, China was the only major economy to register a positive growth. And its GDP per capita reached over 10,000 US dollars, more than 600 times the nominal value in 1952. And the OECD predicts this year, China will contribute 1/3 of world economic growth. And it's expected to make even more progress when the world recovers from the pandemic.
Now, China's economic marvel is not just about its GDP. Every key aspect of its economy, be it agriculture, industry, trade, or people's livelihoods, has been improving at the same time. For example, annual crop yields in the country remained above 600 billion kilograms since 2015, and that is 6 times the amount in 1949 when the People's Republic of China was founded. Per capita grain supply also stayed well above the international 400 kilogram safety line in recent years. Meanwhile, average disposable income per capita also skyrocketed hundreds of times, excluding price factors, especially after reform and opening up in 1978. By the end of last year, China had been the world's largest manufacturer for about 11 years, and for the first time, it became the #1 goods and services trader. And with the goal of shared prosperity, the Communist Party of China also managed to lead everyone in the country out of extreme poverty. Well, this year's Double 11 shopping festival wrapped up yesterday with Tmall reporting total sales of $84.6 million and JD reporting almost $54.9 million. In a departure from previous festivals, e-commerce sites this year did not publicize their real-time sales during the event, but they did have some other clever ideas. Well, Zhang Shishwan explores what's new in online retail this year.
With consumers being more careful about their shopping dollars this year, brands have been actively embracing new technologies to help shoppers be sure that they're getting just what they want. That includes online virtual fittings.
The biggest disadvantage of online retail is that consumers cannot try things on. So once we learned about this new application in May, we began using it right away. We first do some 3D modeling, gathering overall detailed information about the shoes, and then form a digital model. Then using AI and AR, the algorithm can recognize the shape of the foot and show how it will look when it's tried on.
By giving the phone a good look at your feet, the shoes easily slip on the screen, and you can do some turns to see how the shoes fit with your style. The brand has sold 100,000 pairs of shoes this year thanks to its new applications of AR. Many brands are now integrating virtual functions into their digitalization. South Korean fashion brand Gentle Monster and luxury brands Gucci and Dior are all working with social app Zapato on services like this.
Well, I feel like I'm actually wearing the shoes right on my feet. And while applications of mixed reality or augmented reality technologies may seem new to the e-commerce sector, the evolving concept of metaverse is suggesting even more new approaches. After all, people now buying digital goods online are seeking for unique experiences.
And of course, the latest idea in new experiences is the metaverse, the latest buzzword in the tech industry. Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg introduced it recently while changing the name of his company to Meta, and it's set to describe a system of endless, interconnected virtual communities where people can meet, work, and play. Zuckerberg described it as a virtual environment which you can enter instead of just looking at it on a screen.
In the metaverse, every item has its own value and a way to price it. A unique artwork in real life can be digitalized into a unique work in the virtual world, where it will also have a unique value, but a value arrived at with different concepts. Traditionally, in the game world, no one would care about the value of a painting. But the metaverse is another new world where items each have their own identities.
Playing on these concepts during the just concluded shopping gala, luxury brand Coach joined the Tmall Luxury Pavilion's Metaverse Art Exhibition, launching a collection of digital works. If you bought the right item in the real world, Coach gave you an item from the virtual world. It wound up giving away 1,000 of them, and the company's owner sees more to come.
All of the mega applications, but also some small applications that are developing, are making China really the leader in digital innovation. And we are invested in terms of creating a digital center of expertise here in Shanghai. We started that a bit more than 1 year ago, so it's the beginning of the journey for the artificial intelligence.
Using blockchain technology, shoppers receive their own unique sequence number for their digital collections, which are then stored in the system. It's the maturing digital technologies of blockchain, AI, AR, and VR that have made the applications more appealing to online customers. It's all making possible real competition in unreal worlds.
Almost all industries and lives have been digitalized. Especially nowadays, the younger generation have been spending more time on digital networks. For example, luxury brands like LV have been launching clothes with its logos in games. That proves to be attractive for young people, because in real life they have already accepted these brands, and the new virtual world may become a more important battleground for the brands.
Lu says there's still plenty of space for these concepts to be fully implemented, as ideally, in the metaverse, there will be virtual tools for communications, social networking, and finance. And that, of course, could imply the need for more market supervision from real regulators. 张世璇, ICS for CGTN, Shanghai.
Well, on that note, let's take a look at commodity markets today. Global supply woes sent coffee prices to a 7-year high. That's as Brazil, the top grower, faced plunging production after drought and frost damaged trees. Also, Arabica supply Colombia is struggling with excess rain that we saw cutting yields and threatening to bring plant disease. Meanwhile, oil prices falling today, wiping out gains from the previous session as the dollar continues to firm up on expectations that the U.S. Central Bank will bring forward an increase to interest rates in an effort to tame inflation. Gold, on the other hand, eased pressured by a strong dollar, but prices were set for their biggest weekly jump in 6 months as concerns over high U.S. consumer prices drove interest in the metal as an inflation hedge. And as South Africa battles a power crisis, industry players have come together to find long-term solutions. The Africa Energy Week is underway in Cape Town, where stakeholders are discussing the future of sustainable power supply on the continent. Now, the goal is to end energy poverty by 2030. Here's CGTN's Julie Shire with more.
The Africa Energy Week, focusing on future energy supplies for the continent, kicked off in Cape Town. Outside, many South Africans continued to endure rotational power cuts that have disrupted communication networks, businesses and transport services.
Load shedding is ongoing. It depends on the capacity connected and the ability to manage that load of energy in a particular way. So load shedding is going to be around for some time, and we must rebuild our capacity so that we avoid load shedding.
South Africa has been struggling to keep the lights on despite a comprehensive energy plan. It needs to come up with a speedy solution to keep Africa's most industrialized economy running. The government has started relaxing laws in the heavily regulated sector, but there's no quick fix. Troubled state power utility Eskom still generates 90% of the country's power.
Eskom has been this slow, heavy monopoly that hasn't been able to deal with the needs of South Africa. I think South Africa took an affirmative step on the 100-megawatt fields. Open it up now so that thousands of megawatts can be built, both within South Africa as well as in your neighbors.
Many African nations have joined the global movement championing greener energy. However, there's still a heavy dependence on fossil fuels in South Africa and other countries.
There's a big push to start going more into the renewable sector. And I think each country has to evaluate how they can utilize their resources. I don't think it is fair for other countries to come in and push their agendas on places like South Africa.
But the reality is that across the continent, more than 600 million Africans have no access to electricity, dashing hopes of ending energy poverty by 2030.
We still need to develop our countries, so we need energy. We still need to give energy and gas to our population. We still need to improve the lifestyle of our population. For that reason, we still need to produce oil and gas, even to produce coal in our countries.
Oil and gas continues to play a critical role on the African continent, but stakeholders here are hoping to find the right solutions for Africa's energy challenges. Julie Shara, CGTN, Cape Town.
And still in South Africa, the government will review quotas allocated to fishermen to catch rock lobsters in the upcoming fishing season. Now, the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment has taken the decision following an uproar from the small-scale and commercial fishing sectors, which would have been badly hit by the proposed cuts in allocations. CGTN's Travis Andrews has more details.
South Africa's West Coast rock lobster total allowable catch, or TAC, is a yearly allocation of fishing quotas. This year's TAC has been set aside by the country's Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment after concerns were raised by the small-scale and commercial fishing sectors. The department imposed deep cuts in quota allocations because scientists believe the fishery is 98% overfished. That decision, however, is being reviewed.
I'm asking them to review the appropriateness of the proportional cuts within the various sectors of the fishery. I'm asking them to review the data on poaching estimates used in the TAC model. Further, I'm requesting them to advise on whether the current state of the cut is appropriate.
Small-scale fishermen believe they are the ones most affected, as they rely on rock lobsters to put food on the table. Poaching has left the fishery heavily depleted though, and the total allowable catch quota is usually informed by stock assessments.
The 600-ton TAC determined for the 21-22 fishing season represents a 28.3% reduction from the previous season. At the time of the announcement, officials indicated the decision was based on an updated stock assessment for the West Coast rock lobster sector, which indicated a deterioration in stock levels.
Under the review, small-scale fishermen are still allowed to fish under the 2020-2021 fishing quotas, and many are relieved by this decision.
The TAC has been reduced over a period of, say, 10 years, with about, give and take, 70% of the fish that's been taken away from the coastal fishers. And hence that there was a protest a couple of weeks ago against this new TAC, where they're going to reduce it again by 28%.
South Africa's Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment says it is acutely aware that a large number of fishermen rely on the West Coast rock lobster resource for their livelihoods, and that the proposed cut will have a devastating impact on their already stretched incomes. It stresses, though, that it must be balanced against the need to protect stocks that continue to decline. Ghanaian News, CGTN, Cape Town.
And before we leave you today, a quick look at Africa's currencies. South Africa's rand adding to earlier gains today. That's after Finance Minister unveiled a spending plan for the state that would see it sticking to its path of fiscal consolidation. Meanwhile, Nigeria's naira firming to about 540 naira per dollar on the black market. It continues to hover around 410, 430 naira per dollar on the official spot market, broadly in a range held since June. Well, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. Remember, you can send your feedback to the contacts on your screen. You can also follow us on our various digital media platforms. From me, Uche Okoronkwo, and the rest of the team, thanks for watching.